Mike's phone advocacy in meetings and around clients?
I got anxious hearing his phone ring. Another one-liner was, "Is that your wife's perfume? You smell on me?"
Like, Donna, of all people, is going to absolutely crush him.
Yeah.
Yeah, and see through his ruse. It's unbelievable. Harvey's driver gets in an accident. Chaos ensues, and Harvey comes out as the hero.
Per usual.
Hi, and welcome to Suits on Suits, your favorite rewatch podcast of the TV show Suits. We're your hosts, Jared and Quinn Mayberry, and today we're going to be talking about episode 5 of season 1. What are your hot takes, buddy? Let's dive right in.
Okay, I've got 2 for this episode. My first one is Mike's photographic memory has a huge blind spot. All things Harvard.
What my hot take is, it's interesting to me that objections play so well on TV to lionize the attorney making the objections. In real life, most attorneys will not make an objection during a trial unless it's absolutely necessary because they think it loses them credibility with the jury.
I think that that's a really good point, and it cuts. So different attorneys have different theories about this.
Yeah.
I think sometimes people want to lodge objections to throw off the other attorney's flow if they think that they're, especially if they think they're maybe more inexperienced. But yeah, generally speaking, there's a concern that the jury is going to wonder, what are they trying to keep from us? And they want to know as much as possible about the case and then make their decision. So.
Totally agree. But during a trial on a TV show or in a movie, it's often used to show the legal acumen of the attorney.
Absolutely. How capable the attorney is.
Totally agree. All right, you said you got one more?
One more. This pro se plaintiff knows his way around the courtroom better than a lot of lawyers.
He's great. They make him a fantastic orator.
Couldn't agree more. All right, let's dive into this episode. What are some alt titles you have?
Okay, so I'm going to start with the real title first. Yeah. The real title is Bailout, which I actually think is a pretty good title.
Yeah.
Yeah. My fake title, which may be the title of this podcast episode, With Friends Like These, ...
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think that hits a lot of the points from this episode where it's Trevor's just a total anchor. And
it's Trevor's actions towards Mike, Mike's actions toward Harvey. It's a lot of people kind of acting out and who are supposed friends of the other person.
You said that this is going to be the title of this episode? I hope not.
Oh no. With brothers like these.
What was he trying to say there?
Maybe it's with brothers like these.
All right. So mine was, I agree. Bailout was a good one. Harvey is bailing out everybody in this episode.
Yep.
Mine was codependency. Joy's dependent on her work here. Trevor's dependent on Mike. And again, everyone's dependent on Harvey.
Yeah, agreed. And Harvey is feeding into it too. He's codependent with Mike for
Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah.
And so before we dive into the episode, can you give us a little bit of a highlight of what happened here?
Yeah, totally. The tight recap here, guys. Number 1, Mike's working with Harvey on a large 9-figure licensing deal with Joy, the co-founder and CEO of a doll manufacturing company. Mike and Trevor rekindle their friendship after Mike bails Trevor out of jail. Harvey's driver gets in an accident, and the cab that hit his driver sues Harvey and the driver. Chaos ensues, and Harvey comes out as the hero.
Per usual.
With that, I think we can kind of jump into like the general discussion and give me some top of the line takes on what you thought thematically happened here.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've moved from coffee to Red Bull.
Yeah.
We saw that at the beginning.
We're revving up.
Yeah.
We have wings.
Yeah. Mike is getting used to the life of a junior associate here.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm looking forward to getting your takes later in the episode on the situation with Trevor and Trevor re-entering the scene. I had so many strong feelings here.
Oh, I mean, it triggered my immediate like scream, almost like a scary movie reaction to like, don't go in the closet.
I immediately was like, you got to be fucking kidding me.
I know. Absolutely.
As soon as I saw that it was Trevor calling.
One of the things I was thinking about is like, why are dolls so creepy in the hands of adults?
Yeah, like it's creepy.
Yeah, it's always creepy. Look, we really like Harvey. They've shown that he's a stand-up dude. He's a great guy. Is this the episode where we full on fall for Harvey?
100% for me.
I totally agree.
I'm happy you brought that up. I thought that Harvey was always this aspirational character who just had his stuff together, and he was just cool in so many different ways.
Yeah.
This was the first episode where I really liked Harvey or I guess I fell for Harvey as a character.
My bleeding heart fell for him.
Yeah, I went from liking Harvey to loving Harvey in this episode.
Totally agree with you. Yeah. He's no longer just a soulless, heartless superhero. He's like awesome.
Yeah, he's awesome. Yeah. There was one thing though that I guess I take it back. There's one note. Did you notice at the beginning whenever Harvey said, if you wanted to do good, you should have been a fake doctor? Great line.
It's a fantastic line. It got me. I laughed.
Yeah. I thought as a quick plug, there are many different ways to practice law.
Yes. Yes. There are a lot of ways to not just be a shill.
Yeah. For big corporations.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree.
Okay. Let's dive into some of the different thematic plot points. So we've got this Harvey and Lewis dynamic that's going to be playing out hopefully forever, but anything that stood out to you from this episode?
Well, let me dive into maybe a superficial one, at the beginning there, Lewis comes in after a victory, supposed victory. We talk about this in a little bit.
Yeah.
But, and he's singing the Harvard fight song. First of all, a little bit of a cringe over here.
Oh, absolutely.
But do you know the Harvard fight song?
Not at all.
Yeah. I don't think that's a requirement of a graduate level student at Harvard?
Not at all. Okay. I don't think for any grad student. I'm sure you could find a handful of them, but to me that's associated with the undergraduate school.
Yeah, I agree.
At any university where it's you're going to the sports, I'm sure at the football games people are actually singing the fight song. Another one-liner was, "Is that your wife's perfume? You smell on me?" I'm totally botching the line, but he's got another great one-liner about his wife's perfume, and
about
then goes,
Lewis's wife's perfume.
Yeah, and then goes on to explain the joke and say, "Oh wait, you don't have a wife."
Yeah. Oh no, I know that you don't have a wife.
Yeah, that's right. He explains the joke.
Yeah,
and I somehow like it better.
Yeah. But I guess it's one of those two where after the first one, what's Lewis supposed to say? "Joke's on you, I don't have a wife."
Yeah, exactly. He's like, I'm going to beat him to the punch here and just rub it in. There was another little quip about Lewis's stress balls at the end of the episode. But more substantively, we see this dynamic play out with Harvey and Lewis on this episode where Harvey needs a favor from Lewis.
Yeah.
In the car crash plot line, they're in court. This is happening in front of Judge Palermo, and Lewis apparently has some relationship with Judge Palermo.
Exactly.
And he has to call in a favor Harvey has to call in a favor from Lewis to get this preferential hearing in front of Judge Palermo.
To expedite it.
Expedite it, exactly. Yep. Did you see how this played out, though, where Lewis immediately does Harvey a favor and then tries to cash that in?
Well, it was interesting to me because Harvey doesn't strike me as the kind of guy to offer a favor that he doesn't know, or to, what they say about trial attorneys, you only ask questions you know the answers to.
Yeah.
It kind of feels like he's given an open-ended offer to give a favor. We soon find out that he's not willing to go to the end of the earth to concede that favor.
Yeah.
But
I think the first request was pretty unreasonable, though, where he asked for Donna to start working for... Lewis asked Donna to start working for him.
Yeah.
And Harvey's response is essentially, you got to ask Donna.
Yes. I think, again, he just knows how to be a decent guy. It's like...
And Lewis is the exact opposite side of the coin, where it's like, what should I do in this situation? I'm going to do the opposite.
Or he's going to think that he has such great people skills, he's able to convince her to join his team. And of course, we all know he's going into a freaking wood chipper. Like Donna, of all people, is going to absolutely crush him. Yeah. And see through his ruse. It's unbelievable.
And then, so from there, he, I guess, gets frustrated, and ultimately, because Donna doesn't come to work for him, and then he publishes something in the newspaper that exposes Harvey's in this litigation.
Yeah, it's a way to kind of paint him with a bad brush. And Jessica then admonishes Harvey for
it's bad PR for the firm.
Bad PR for the firm. Yeah, exactly. And, that immediately, and Harvey talks about it later, is like he immediately undercuts his own favor. Harvey says, like, if you hadn't done that, I would have owed you. You just burned the bridge there.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting. But how did you think about the conclusion? Like, I had some thoughts about at the very end of the episode, this kind of arc, I think, ended with Harvey showing that he does respect Lewis.
Yeah.
And Lewis coming to the realization that maybe some of the ribbing is just good collegial fun, and that maybe that he should stop taking it so personally and kind of work together.
I'm curious to see that play out.
I agree.
I hope that relationship matures and evolves, and where they're still going to be, at ends with, or at odds rather, with each other, but it'd be interesting to see it take a slightly different form rather than just always being like the exact opposite side of the coin.
Well, I think for now, from a storytelling perspective, most of the tension is born from internal dynamics between those two. The question is, are the writers going to write in a third party opposition that's going to require them to come together to resolve
that'd
the
be
crises?
interesting.
Yeah.
I would like to see it.
Yeah. Same. It gives you the opportunity to then have juxtaposition down the road between the two of them. But I think it'd be interesting to see if some large enough kind of villain forces the entire firm to come together.
Despite falling for Harvey in this episode, he's towing the line with being a bully here with the taxi driver.
Totally agree.
Coming in a bit heavy-handed. I think that where this flips is we quickly find out that the taxi driver is just lying about the red light.
Yep.
But for that, I'd really be siding pretty heavily with the taxi driver here. Yeah,
they're pretty fast and loose with this idea that anyone who is claiming to be hurt or injured or has damages against someone else is inherently just juicing the system.
Yeah, I think
which
we saw that play out in the pharmaceutical situation where it's like
we saw Quinn get heated.
yeah, where it's like there's a situation where somebody has been massively wrong.
Yeah, they even admit it by the end of it.
Yeah,
no apologies.
And so this was obviously a much smaller case than
totally
that. Agree. If they had been in a hurry like they were, and then caused this accident, if the other person, if it led to these damages, they should be responsible for it. But again, massive caveat, because we find out the taxi driver's lying. Yeah.
So Harvey's righteous, and he's acting in a righteous manner for his driver. I do have one question for you. So they talk about the damages, and one of the things driving the large damage request is the medallion.
Yeah.
They said it would cost $300,000 in that year, which I guess would be 2010, 2011, depending on when it was filmed. And I know it was released in 2011. I'd be curious if you thought that was reasonable. And the way I'm going to ask you is, in 2013, which is the peak price for medallions in New York City, how much do you think a medallion costs?
I vaguely remember seeing some articles about this because it did get so high.
Yeah.
I want to say $500,000.
Double that.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So I know that there was this period where there was a real constriction and they were soaring. But.
Well, yeah. So $1 million is the peak in 2013. Obviously, ride shares are becoming in vogue. So that peak is short lived. Around 2015, there's been a substantial drop. Where do you think they land?
Oh man. So I know that they've dropped massively, but 2 years, I'm going to guess they were at, so from $1 million to 200,000.
$650K. It's
oh
still
my
near.
gosh.
It's not near. It's like almost half the way down, but it's absurdly high, right? And you got to remember, a lot of these cab drivers are taking out loans for them.
Oh, 65 or 650?
650.
Oh, okay.
Did I say 65?
No. I was hearing 65, but yeah. So 650. So it's still
it's still pretty high. Yeah. The adoption of the rideshare hasn't fully commenced.
I way overcorrected there, where I was expecting it to just drop to close to, some tiny fraction of it. But within 2 years, that's crazy.
That's crazy. If it's an investment, that's a crazy drop.
Yeah.
So the next data point I'm going to give you is 2019.
Oh, okay. 200.
It was around 130K. So you're a lot
Man,
closer. But
yeah.
to think over in less than a decade, man, in 6 years to drop by an order of magnitude almost.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah. Needless to say, if your attenuated damages argument is that you lost out on the opportunity, now his argument may be a little flawed because he's arguing that he lost out on the opportunity to buy it at $300K and it's going to be $350 in the next year. The damages really are $50K from the delta. Maybe not. Maybe there are other damages stemming from the fact that he doesn't have a medallion.
Well, and then also to put a finer point on this, there are some foreseeability issues from a legal perspective.
For sure. I honestly thought that the peaks and then now valley of the damages there was quite interesting. One thing that kind of jumped out to me, and I'd be curious to get your take on this. Harvey frames this situation as either a fight for insurance or a lawsuit against Harvey and the driver independently, as if those two things are bifurcated or kind of separate concepts. I'd like to get your take on that from a legal perspective.
Yeah, so I've got a note on this actually. I'm happy you brought it up. That's something that they got wrong.
Okay.
I think that, like so many of these things, the show is just trying to fit these concepts into a narrative arc that's compelling and
creating
interesting.
Drama. Yeah,
absolutely. I get why they did that. They tried to frame the taxi driver as a bit of a villain who had
overreach,
just an overreach, where they had an alternative where they could have quickly resolved this through insurance, and instead they chose this more drastic measure. In reality, there's not this clear distinction. So they said that I believe at some point they said the repairs would be handled by insurance and these other damages claims would be handled through a civil suit. So insurance would cover all of the damages.
Yep.
So you've got liability insurance, which is going to cover all of the resulting damages from the taxi drivers or from any party's negligence.
Yep.
Anything that they are liable for, it would cover virtually all of the damages up to some certain limit. But it's not a distinct mechanism to collect. It's not like you collect for damage to your car through insurance, but you can't possibly collect for other damages through insurance.
Yeah, harm, injury, lost wages, any of those things. It still falls under the insurance umbrella.
Under liability insurance. And so you do have different lines of insurance on your auto policy. Without diving into them too much, you do have a separate line for property damage.
Got it.
Okay, I'm going to stay above the fray on some of the details there, but the punchline is you would start either on your own or with the help of an attorney by trying to collect from the insurance company.
Yep.
And then if you weren't able to reach a fair resolution or a resolution that was reasonable and you were satisfied with, then an attorney would potentially file a lawsuit.
Yep.
Or theoretically a pro se litigant.
Yeah. And we can get into that pro se conversation a little later.
But I guess to be clear, pro se just means somebody who's not represented by a lawyer.
Yeah.
You would start by dealing with insurance, and then if you weren't able to reach a resolution, it would be resolved through a civil lawsuit. Yep. So those aren't bifurcated things. They're things that happen on the same timeline. The insurance negotiations would just happen before the lawsuit.
Yep.
Which I think brings up one more point here, which is the lawsuit would be playing out over the span of probably many, many months, potentially several years.
Yeah.
Just something to be aware of if you're ever in a situation like this. You're not going to...
You can't call up Judge Palermo and get the next day docket.
Yeah.
Get on the docket the next day, i.e. get on the court schedule the next day.
So another point that's worth talking about here is the fee shifting provisions.
Yeah, they talk about it in whenever they're kind of negotiating the settlement at the witness stand.
Yeah, exactly. So the leverage being, if this is decided in Harvey's favor, his attorney's fees would be paid by the cab driver.
Yeah, which is pretty punitive.
Yeah, and I don't think it's accurate.
Yeah, fair. It would be a deterrent for the plaintiff.
Yeah, and so I believe that's the rule in England.
Yeah.
And in some other countries, but the general rule in the United States and certainly in New York is that both sides bear the cost of their attorney's fees.
Unless there's some kind of contractual provision that states otherwise?
Or if there's statute that says in certain situations, there will be fee shifting provisions.
Got it.
But generally speaking, you're responsible for your own attorney's fees.
Yeah, which makes sense, right? Because what you're trying to do, at least in our system, is if you have a complaint or you have a valid claim against someone, you shouldn't be deterred from making that claim.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the theory behind it.
Right. Because if you work up against a defendant who is deep pocketed and has a very expensive lawyer, you could be not only risking, the loss of your potential upside, but you could be risking hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in legal fees on their side.
Yeah. And sometimes there are statutes that allow for attorney's fees for essentially the exact opposite reason. So essentially to shift the balance back into a more equitable situation where somebody might have a claim that's only worth, let's say, $10,000,
yeah,
but it's a really meaningful $10,000, but it might cost, let's say, $100,000 in attorney's fees to pursue it. That person effectively would have no course of action without the statute. But now, because of the statute, an attorney could potentially take on that case and pursue it. And if they lose, they're not going to get anything. But if they think that the case has a lot of merit, they could pursue that case, and the person who had the $10,000 claim would have a chance at justice.
That makes sense. Yeah. So that was an interesting one. I think there's another, nuanced legal point here that they talk about, which is vicarious liability, where the cab driver is claiming that Harvey is liable for the negligence of his limousine driver. I'd be curious to hear your take on that.
Yeah. So let me just break down the topic of vicarious liability. The general rule is the principal or employer is responsible for the actions of their agent.
Okay, got it. Yeah. So in this case, Harvey is the principal and the driver is the agent.
Yeah, exactly. And so the general philosophy is that you're setting these actions into motion for your profit, and you should bear the resultant cost. Where this gets tricky is commonly litigated is whether or not somebody's an independent contractor or an employee. There are these different tests in different states, but in essence...
Oh, you're saying the law's complicated?
The law is... It turns on how much control the principal exercised over the agent.
Got it.
Or to put it in more practical terms, how much control the employer exercised over the either employee or independent contractor. So if here we have a handful of facts.
Totally. Yeah.
The driver seems to be driving his own vehicle because he's talking about the repairs and his responsibility for the repairs.
Yep.
He seems to set his own schedule.
It doesn't seem like I don't have any facts that say that he only drives for Harvey. I think kind of on the spectrum, obviously it's all gray and facts and circumstances matter greatly. But on the one hand, you got cab driver that you jump into a random cab and you just tell them where you want to go. And on the other side of it is you have a personal driver who drives exactly how you want to be driven and only works for you at all times.
Yeah, full time. And to just take it even further, they're a W-2 employee of yours.
Great.
And then you get into all these complicated situations where do Lyft and Uber have vicarious liability because they're directing the actions of their drivers and they're pairing the driver to the to the rider. In a lot of situations, Lyft or Uber would have vicarious liability. Whether or not the driver is an employee or an independent contractor would be incredibly important
to determining whether or not Harvey's
liable.
Yep.
Exactly. But generally speaking, if Harvey is employing this driver, he would be liable.
Yeah.
If he's employing an independent contractor, arguably he would not be liable. One thing that's often overlooked is if the tortfeasor is liable, so the driver, they're also going to be on the hook for whatever damages were caused.
Interesting.
So the driver, even if Harvey is liable, the driver is also liable.
Yeah, that makes sense. You have to convince the court that the driver is liable for some negligence. And then it's more, if there's vicarious liability, Harvey then is obligated to pay for those damages, but it doesn't remove the liability of the driver.
Exactly. And so, and in fact, there's almost never going to be vicarious liability unless the driver or the primary tortfeasor is found liable.
That makes sense.
But yeah, this is something that often gets overlooked because in really large cases, typically the employee would be judgment proof and it would just be very hard to collect a large amount from any normal employee. You know, it's like, whereas a large corporation, if they set these actions into motion and they caused, let's say, millions of dollars in damages, the plaintiff is able to actually collect from them.
Yeah, that's where they're going to seek the damages to be
Yeah.
paid. Yeah. So that's a really great summation of vicarious liability, and I think super helpful in how they helping bridge the gap on how Harvey had to join the lawsuit here.
Yeah.
We talked about this earlier, but maybe just to go a little deeper here on the car crash situation, how great was the cab driver in the opening statement?
Did a fantastic job.
Yeah.
And he also did a fantastic job in the hearing with the judge whenever he's arguing, we're all equals in the eye of the law.
Yeah.
I think he said it there. Anyways, the judge was clearly impressed and let the case go to trial.
Maybe Harvey found his second associate. I mean, clearly having a law degree doesn't matter. So
totally. As a matter of fact, he was a little bit of a hypocrite there whenever he went down to intimidate him. He's like,
I agree.
Just because you know something about this doesn't make you a lawyer. I'm like, well, he thought that it was enough for Mike.
Yeah. That kind of brings us to the next big theme or plot point here, which has a lot to do with Mike, is the doll company deal.
I keep calling it a toy company because something about doll companies just feels so creepy.
It's so creepy. Well, actually, it's funny. I thought the head fake that the writers gave when Mike goes to Joy's house and she walks in to have tea and has all the dolls that are created based on her children sitting around the table, and like tongue-in-cheek plays at Mike like, oh yeah, here, names the dolls and says they're here to join us.
Yeah.
And then for 30 seconds, I thought, and Mike certainly thought, that we were going to have a very weird archetypal character that was going to be insane. And then she just throws it away quite quickly. I thought that was a pretty fun plot point to me.
I thought that was
because
nice.
I thought it could have worked the other way, but it would have felt really tropey. It was kind of, she showed her charisma and like sense of humor in that.
Totally. And the self-awareness there. Yeah. Speaking of charisma, Mike's really charismatic and relatable, likable, and kind of wins over the CEO. I believe her name's Joy. Is that
Joy,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. So he wins over Joy, but he fails to get it here a little bit.
I know. He really does. He misses the point.
He's a junior associate that's totally reasonable, but he's a junior associate who's been given all of these opportunities to do more here.
Yeah, he kind of misses the forest for the trees, right? He's thinking he needs to charm again, and Harvey has a broader perspective, right?
Yeah.
We're here to close the licensing deal. We're here to convince Joy guide her rather on how she should proceed with the transaction.
Yeah, absolutely. And he just kind of misses that.
One of the points that I thought was kind of interesting on this plot point, the turn of this plot point was when Joy decides she's going to sell the company instead of pursue the licensing deal.
Well, so I assume you'd know much more about this than me, but I'm thinking here you're going to generate legal fees in either situation.
That's kind of my thought. I mean, you do, to the writer's credit, you're going to lose a client, right?
Yeah,
if you sell.
great point.
So I think to them, they're thinking it's a big licensing deal. Now, how much money you generate from a licensing deal is less important how large the licensing deal is and more important how complicated it is.
That makes sense.
But 9 figures probably going to be complicated.
Yeah.
And then you still get to maintain the relationship with the client for a future sale or a future financing transaction, future joint venture, or a future licensing deal. So I guess I get that point, but hey, man, as long as it isn't continuing to operate as usual, you still got a deal on the horizon.
Totally. That's interesting to get your take because that's kind of what I was thinking, but I didn't have as much familiarity with these types of deals.
That makes sense.
And then I guess my last thought on this was Harvey invites the family out to visit her.
Yeah.
And then gets the deal back on the table. She realizes, you know what? Love spending time with family, but maybe I don't want that to be my full-time gig.
You know what it made me think is Harvey understood Joy because she's a bit of Harvey.
Yeah.
Like she is.
I didn't even think about that. Yeah, I think
she's
that's right.
a workaholic who likes working, and too much time with family was going to drive her crazy. I think for Mike,
Harvey
he couldn't
gets
see
it.
He gets it. He gets her.
He gets her.
He gets a CEO. He gets the business person who like finds a lot of purpose in their work, and Mike is kind of missing that right now because right now he's in the grind.
Let's talk about Trevor.
Okay.
So, what'd you think?
This is a hard one, man. Trevor. We all have a friend that's close to Trevor. We all have points in our life when we are trying to transition into maybe a little more responsible portion of our life, and we have friends who are maybe just lagging behind in that
transition,
that they're still in the prior phase, right? And I think that it's hard because Mike clearly feels a bunch of loyalty to him.
Yeah.
And I think in a lot of ways, he probably remembers Trevor being there for him. Like, the one thing we don't
that's
really...
a really good point.
Yeah, one thing we don't really see, but I think the assumption is, like, how many times... I mean, actually, maybe take that back. Trevor was trying to help, and, like, he threw him under the bus, but he was actually trying to help Mike out in the first episode.
That is a complicated situation where it's like, I think, was he trying to help him out? Maybe before the setup, but I felt like, I don't know how much he really cared about Harvey there. About Mike there. I felt like he was using Mike largely as a means to an end. And
you thought he was just a tool.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And
in that case, then I have very little sympathy for Trevor. I was trying to see it from the rosiest perspective possible, which is like...
No, that's fair. And we don't know. And I think to your original point, though, it's like, you're putting yourself in Mike's shoes, and you mentioned how a lot of people can probably relate to having a friend like this. I know I certainly can.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why they put it in. I mean, it's so relatable. Yeah.
And I think that friend has, I can speak from firsthand experience where that friend has been there for me plenty of times. And so I think maybe that's part of where your take on Trevor is coming from, where it's like, you're assuming that he's been there for Mike. And I think that's probably a fair assumption from a story arc perspective. Okay, so we've got this tension between being a loyal friend and knowing when to kind of cut off a toxic relationship.
Yep.
I just couldn't help but think that Mike's loyalty is starting to look a little silly here.
Well, I think it is, and mostly because we know that Mike knows that Trevor's lying.
He knows that he's lying, and the drug bust is... So there was only so much he could do. He was being like, they were holding him captive at that time. Something like that, there has to be a line that's crossed where you're like, time to move on.
Yeah.
You don't have to have a scorched earth policy where you're trying to bring the other person down in the process, but you just call it quits and go your separate ways.
Yeah, agreed. I guess, it's funny to me because based on the arc of the relationship, I would have guessed Mike would, at the end of this, resolve to say, nope, Harvey's 100% right. Let's move on. It kind of went the other way.
I know. I was really surprised by that too, where he's like, I'll always pick up. And
yeah, I know.
Call me, like, let me know when you're back in town.
That part was shocking. But one of the parts that I think, again, won me over for Harvey was when Harvey said, let me know what's going on. Like, I'm basically saying, I'm your friend and I'm here to help you out.
Yeah.
I'm here to mentor you. And we'll get into that a little deeper, but
he totally won me over here.
Yeah. But he goes in and tries to save the day for Trevor's, Trevor's caught getting the crap beat out of him and he's being threatened over the $50,000 that he owes. And Harvey steps in and basically negotiates his release. So I'd be curious to hear your kind of take on that. The way he negotiated the release was a bit unique, so I'd be curious to hear your take on that, but also just how Harvey stepped in.
I guess a couple of thoughts. Harvey is being such a good friend. It's kind of funny because it's like, at what point does Harvey kind of take his own advice and cut off Mike a little bit?
I wonder if that's foreshadowing.
Yeah, where it's like, not to totally drop him, but just to set some boundaries on like, all right, if you're going to keep getting yourself into these situations, like, you're going to need to bear the responsibility of the consequences at some point.
Well, agreed. And I think, honestly, Harvey is the closest to avoiding consequences for hiring Mike if he cuts him loose. So, like, I think he could probably dodge most of the responsibility if Mike just weren't at the firm anymore.
Yeah. And I mean, part of the reason my alt title was codependency. It's like, it's just running both ways here.
It's definitely running both ways. It makes you think, Harvey's a loner.
Yeah.
And he's
wants to let somebody in. He's
afraid to let someone in because he knows how he acts.
Yeah.
And how he can be codependent. It makes you want to know his backstory. I hope we get to see that a little more.
I hope so too. My second thought here was essentially an extension of the first, which is just, when is he going to draw that line, and what's that line going to be? When are we going to see it? Okay, so I think that wraps up our discussion on the plot points in the episode. I think we covered them all. I think we hit them all.
Yeah.
Which brings us to our next section, which is suits react.
Yep.
We're going to break down a few legal concepts and give the perspective from two practicing attorneys. And we're going to maybe quickly touch on the law, quickly touch on the culture of law, and just say, weigh in on things that we thought they really got right, and maybe some things that we thought they didn't quite nail.
Let's dive in.
All right. So soft transition here. We were just talking about Harvey and Mike's relationship. Let's talk about mentorship.
Yeah. So I kind of think that I think they got this one right. I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I think that in a lot of ways, a good mentor can bleed into, out of the professional setting and kind of into everyday life setting. I know, prior to law school, I don't think I really had any mentors, but in law school and then following law school, I really gained some mentors that I think of as professional and personal mentors. They kind of bridge both worlds. And I think similarly to that, Harvey's mentorship of Mike is, to some degree, he's only talking on the personal life matters that touch work. So Mike dropped Trevor because it's affecting your work. But I also think he's just expanding to really like Mike. But so
I had a different take here where I haven't spent nearly as much time at a firm as you. I also spend a lot of my time practicing with our dad,
yes.
where the personal and professional lines certainly get blurred. But setting aside maybe how extreme they make some of these plot points, because it makes the show so much more interesting.
Absolutely.
Setting that aside, I felt like the level to which the hands-on mentorship happened in the show, I thought it was like, I yearned for that, and I felt like that couldn't have been real at a big law firm.
I disagree.
Okay.
I think it can be. Now, it's not always the case, but I think it can absolutely happen. And I think when you get into those places, it makes you want to stay.
I mean, having any one-on-one conversations with people you really respect, I always found incredibly motivating. I just assumed it never actually evolved into something that was this substantial.
And maybe it doesn't for a lot of people, but I think that for me it has, and I think I'm assuming for a lot of people it has. I think one of the benefits of being at kind of in a law firm setting is you're working with a lot of very smart, talented human beings, which is, I think,
absolutely
a rare work environment. To have that many of your colleagues be that kind of capable. That many capable colleagues. And when you get that personal relationship with someone more senior than you that has more experience, it can be really profound because they have tons of life experience that kind of matches your projection, right? Like it's further along the path that you're going down.
Yeah. Would you concede that this level of codependence is typically not
100%?
Yeah.
Well, let's put it this way. I would assume that it isn't this extreme.
Yeah.
Now, that's
setting aside the hostage situation, coming through with, like, if you had to pony up a big sum of money or just really exposing yourself in a meaningful way.
Yeah, obviously there are extremes in this show, and it's for drama, but I think it may be in a situation where you're only working for one partner. Like we talked about this earlier in the previous episode, there are different structures, but if you're in a structure where you're only working for a single partner, I still think that this level of codependency is too far, but
you get dynamics that are
similar.
Yeah, so interesting. I feel like I had found that level of mentorship, but again, working with our dad.
Yeah, I know that.
And so I assumed that would be something that was really tricky to find in a like, bigger, more structured bureaucratic system. And that's really cool to hear you found it. I guess bit of a split take here on whether or not that's realistic to find in these settings.
For the next topic, we're going to jump into another cultural point, which is Mike's phone etiquette in meetings and around clients.
I got anxious hearing his phone ring. I got it. So here's one thing that I think
Pavlovian almost.
Yeah. Here's one thing that I think Mike is really good at. I think he's great at taking some crap and moving on.
Yep.
Or finding himself in an awkward situation and pushing through it. He's not going to take himself out of the game.
Yep.
Somebody else is going to have to sideline him. And
Agreed.
I think so many people sideline themselves. It's just
shame or guilt. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
I found myself making this mistake from time to time, and I'd like to think I do it less and less now, but where you're like, oh, that it's just so embarrassing. I would never, like, how do you come back from it? It's like,
yeah.
Not that one phone ringing is like the end of the world, but he just time and time again will make these like trip ups where I would be laying in bed thinking about it before going to sleep.
I would be ruminating for days and being like, oh my God, how embarrassing. Like, also the phone call he gets in the meeting is from Trevor. Like, you definitely, even if it rings and it's annoying and it gets caught up in the meeting, you say, wow, that was embarrassing, and silence, right? Like, I guess he gets egged on by Jessica and Harvey, but like, I think you just say, nope, I'm sorry. And then you chuck the phone out the window.
Could not agree more. So we're on exactly the same page here.
Yeah.
Whenever the phone rings in court, he steps out to take it.
Yeah.
I feel like he has a level of confidence where he's just living his life here
but it also is kind of like he's tripping as he's doing it. He's
totally.
kind of like, he's like almost a little spastic.
Fair point.
He's almost a little spastic in doing it. What do you think about the answering the phone in front of the client? That one I think is like absolutely a no-go.
A total no-go. I wouldn't have answered my phone in any of those three situations.
Agreed.
And I would have, so if my phone's ringing in front of a client, I see it, I just silence it, put it in my pocket. Wouldn't have felt that awkward there. But
agreed.
You have your phone on loud. It's ringing while you're in a meeting with a ton of high-powered people. You have your phone's ringing in the courtroom. I would be so bashful after either of those.
It definitely feels like a 2011 issue though, because like, who actually has their phone ringing under the age of 60?
I can't remember the last time I had my phone set to loud.
Yeah. So he clearly, Mike, butchers that one. It keeps the storyline going, so we get it, and it's definitely provides some silly comedic relief and shows him as kind of a little dough lawyer.
Yeah, exactly. As he's still, I mean, we're episode 5 here. They're over 100.
Yeah.
We're really like, he can't mature as a lawyer in episode 5.
I agree.
Yeah. So
he's learning his lessons.
He's learning his lessons. Here's just one more. But as like from a cultural perspective, I think as a junior, having a ton of deference, I guess maybe to state this more generally, is really important. And answering your phone in the middle of a meeting is the opposite of that.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's a no.
Don't answer your phone in the middle of a meeting with 10 other people.
Yeah. But you did bring up the phone ringing in court, and it kind of brings me back. It kind of brings me to our third point, which is pro se litigation, or as we discussed earlier, kind of representing yourself in a litigation matter.
So I think that this is incredibly realistic from the perspective of like it happening.
Yeah.
It happens a lot. So depending on what numbers you look at, so it's going to be different statistics from state to state, different statistics for federal court versus state court. And maybe most importantly, you're going to see widely different statistics for what type of matter.
Absolutely. And
is before the court.
Yeah. Plaintiff versus defendant.
Yeah. And so for family law matters, oftentimes you will see people self-represented. For example, I think it's very realistic for them to depict a pro se litigant.
You mean a pro se litigant who could have been practicing for 20 years?
Yeah, exactly. That part, not quite so much.
Yeah. I would love to see it.
Oftentimes, judges will show a lot of deference to pro se litigants. So whenever I say deference, I guess all I mean there is maybe they're even supposed to by law, but oftentimes they'll want to give the pro se litigant a chance to present their substantive points.
Yes.
And so they won't just kick them out on some procedural ground.
Which to me, from a fairness perspective, reeks of a more fair outcome.
Yeah. And so I think that judges, the vast majority of the time are shooting for a fair resolution. And so,
or they want the trial to be determined on its substance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are procedural things that have to happen. And so sometimes their hands are tied and oftentimes for good reason, but ultimately they're shooting for these things to be decided on the substance. One thing that was that I thought that the pro se litigant got absolutely right was he mentioned his right to be present for all matters before the court.
I was going to ask you that question.
Yeah. So you would almost never have an ex parte. So just a ex parte just meaning a meeting without one of the parties present. And certainly not for a matter as important as like a motion for summary judgment.
Insane.
Yeah.
Again, it's like showing the Harvey at this point, it looks like Harvey's kind of punching down, but the pro se litigant comes back, man, with the fight of his life.
Totally. And wins over the judge and brings up, puts on a great case. I think, so one question for you, he tried to plead the fifth.
Pleading the fifth is reserved for self-incrimination in a criminal case. So rightly, Harvey kind of tells him that's not something that he can do here. But it does foreshadow the fact that he's maybe going to change his tune and be honest on the stand about what happened in the case. Absolutely.
I also think that this was not super realistic from the perspective of somebody just refusing to answer. You know what? I'd strike that.
Yeah.
People will refuse to answer sometimes.
The court will strike that.
Thank you. It didn't ring particularly true to me that somebody just wouldn't comment on the color of the light. They would either say they didn't remember, they would lie about it, or they would be honest and be willing to
have an alternative explanation.
Yeah. That brings us to a little quiz question for you. Yeah. So the pleading...
This is my favorite part of it.
All right. So we're talking about pleading the fifth and the distinctions between civil and criminal cases.
Yep.
I believe we mentioned it before, but it's this fundamental divide in the law. In a criminal case, unlike a civil case, you have the right to counsel.
Yep.
So in criminal cases, you have a number of rights that you might not have in civil cases. And the idea here being there's potentially a lot more on the line here in a criminal case.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you're potentially losing liberty or even life whenever we're talking about criminal matters.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very serious situation.
Yeah. And so as a result, you have these additional rights that I'd mentioned, one of which is the right to counsel. Question for Jared. Do you know the case that enshrined the right to counsel?
Actually, I do, Gwen. It's Gideon v. Wainwright.
That's exactly right. And so this is a case from 1963 where the Supreme Court ruled that the Sixth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution requires U.S. states to provide attorneys to criminal defendants who are unable to afford their own. This case extended the right to counsel, which had been found under the Fifth and Sixth Amendments, to impose requirements on the federal government by imposing those requirements on the states as well.
Got it.
So if there's a state level criminal prosecution, you would now have the right to counsel after Gideon v. Wainwright. And so, the reasoning's similar to what we'd mentioned earlier, but basically the idea is that without the right to counsel, you're potentially going to have this unfair outcome and the consequences are just too high.
They're too high.
They're way too high. And so I think they absolutely made the right call there. And there are even some movements in states, largely in progressive states, to push for the right to counsel, even in certain civil matters. And generally speaking, you don't have that right to counsel in civil matters, but there's this movement in that direction. There's a great book, Gideon's Trumpet, by Anthony Lewis, worth the read for any nerds out there that are interested in learning more.
I haven't read this, so this may be on my reading list.
Yeah, it's a good book.
One of the things I'm excited about in future episodes, and we kind of touched on this earlier in the show, is there going to be a third party that is enough of a villain that Harvey and Lewis are going to have to come together to fight off this?
I would love to see that team up, the Harvey Lewis team up.
They clearly have different strengths, but both pretty talented, capable people.
Yeah. So I hope we see it. And I think that closes out today's episode. Thanks for joining us. And we're looking forward to seeing you all next week.
It was a lot of fun. See you next week.
All the best.